My name is Eward Driehuis, Vice President of Fraud Engineering at ThreatFabric. And today I'm here with Currence Ideal, where we're going to have an in-depth conversation with Daniel van Delft, the CEO. Daniel, thank you for speaking to me today.
Thank you for coming here at the Currence Ideal premises, and happy to have some kind of detailed discussion with you.
That's awesome. Daniel, I know that you've been in payments for, over 20 years. Is that true?
Yes, it is indeed true. As of 2001, I'm a kind of part of the payments ecosystem, starting off with credit cards up to the bank side, where I happened to learn a lot around payments more from a European perspective, and then back to Visa, the scheme, to build the Visa ecosystem, specifically here in the Netherlands, and then ending up, luckily, here on request of the Dutch banks who asked me to lead the beautiful Dutch Ideal scheme.
That's fantastic. But I've been told that before you were in payments, you were actually in automotive. Is that true?
That is 100% correct, because my study actually should have moved me in the other direction, because I studied business economics with a especially in environment and transport. Hence the fact that I ended up in my first step in my career at an automotive company, because originally my purpose was to end up in consulting first, with a specific focus on the environmental consequences of transport in general. But it ended up totally different, because I ended up at Porsche. And from there on, moved quite quickly up towards more the marketing sales side, instead of the more economic side of business. And as you then have in your, let's say, late 20s, early 30s, you're kind of impatient. And then and at a certain time there was a possibility to either continue my career within Porsche, and then had to move as well to either Germany or to the US even. Great opportunities, but I decided together with my wife to stay here. And then at the same moment, of course, what always happens, a recruitment agency passed by and said, isn't it something for you to lead so-called loyalty programs linked to the automotive? And that was the reason why I ended up at that time still Visa Card Services, later International Card Services, which is quite familiar to Dutch consumers for their ANWB Visa Card program.
Right.
And their BMW Visa Card program, and a lot of other programs. So that was the connection and link which brought me into payments.
Right.
And from there on, I stayed in payments.
Yeah. So an ANWB is the General Car Owners Club in the Netherlands, like millions of members. Right?
Yeah, the largest association with 4.x members.
Yeah.
Still, yeah.
So you've been in payments for over 20 years. You came there through loyalty programs, through Porsche. So what do you like about payments? Obviously, you must like it if you're...
Yeah, you learn to like it. Because certainly, and specifically also back in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was not that sexy, to be very honest. It only started to become more sexy also from a banking perspective when it got further digitized. So with the, let's say, the introduction of contactless payments, but I think even more with the introduction of mobile-initiated payments, it became far more sexy in the sense that it is more the central point of interaction for a consumer with the outside world. And I never specifically chose, because I wasn't aware that mobile payments would arise back in 2001, I still had a Nokia.
Right.
As an example. So you grow into it, and let's say the beauty of payments is that it evolves quite quickly. Although within payments we also always say that it is not moving fast enough. But in the end, if you look back over those 20 plus years, a lot has meanwhile changed.
Yeah.
I can interact now with only my mobile phone in my pocket, and I can pay with my credit card, I can pay with my debit card, and I can pay with Ideal. What do I need more?
Exactly, yeah. So how long have you been heading the Currence organization?
3 years and a bit now.
Yeah.
So I joined February 21, actually amidst the COVID pandemic. So it was not the, let's say, the most or the best timing to move and to actually to join a new team. But of course, and that's I think also kind of the beauty and at the same time also, let's say, the challenge within payments, that we tend to know each other because of those, let's say, the needed collaboration among the ecosystem, because without a proper collaboration, we can never be successful. So I already knew quite a lot of dear colleagues here in this building, and that made it also easy to join back in 2021.
Yeah.
So luckily very much welcomed, I hope.
So, and what led you, because working in, you said in 2001 you started in payments, and obviously at one given time you noticed that technology was going to be pivotal, right? This might be super big, these payments, going to be core to our, existence maybe. So when was that, when you really started to notice, hey, this is really taking off?
I think that was already a lot earlier. It was actually already during the period that I worked on the Fortis Bank side as the European head of cards, ATM and point of sale, and realized that there next to, of course, the usual card schemes and the day-to-day interaction you have, there is a lot to gain from further efficiencies, but also from further innovation, and to make payments even more easy, but at the same time stable, secure, and without any borders.
Right.
And that was also one of the main reasons why when Fortis went bankrupt, nothing to do with payments, but the fact that, of course, there was a great plan of taking over ABN AMRO, and the financing behind that, that I deliberately chose to join the Visa scheme. Yeah. Because I saw a lot of potential. And at that time, of course, contactless payments were already launched in the UK, not in Europe yet, further Europe yet. So I really understood the wideness and the influence it has on day-to-day lives far better. And also that you could easily is maybe too easy, but you could be part of that changing ecosystem and could play a role in the changing ecosystem.
Yeah. So now you've been headed, Currence for a few years. I know you've told me previously that there's some big changes coming up, so we'll get there later, I hope.
Yeah.
So, but tell us a little bit about Currence, because I don't know if many people outside of the Netherlands actually know Currence or Ideal.
Yeah, I think Currence is, I would say, quite logic that even in the Dutch market, only a few know who Currence is and what Currence does. Because Currence, in essence, is also the holding entity, the governance entity securing that schemes like Ideal can operate in the way they should, with managing a level playing field, so that there are no, I would say, additional limitations to join the scheme. So if you fulfill the requirements, you can join the scheme. I think that is the primarily role of Currence as an entity securing this role, linked to Ideal, where within the Ideal scheme rules and regulations is also well governed. But in essence, Currence was set up, initiated for that reason of governance. Yes, still with a close cooperation with the banks as shareholders, but as the banks are customers as well on both sides of the chain, so on the issuing side as well as on the acquiring chain, a proper governance model should be in place. And there also, of course, the regulator comes into play because they also have specific reasons. Now, why do only, I would say, we always say that Ideal is world famous in the Netherlands, and that's the Netherlands, but that's due to the fact that Ideal is only reachable for Dutch consumers, because Dutch banks offer Ideal to their consumers. And foreign banks, in principle, unfortunately, didn't take up Ideal from an issuer perspective. So we're not willing to offer Ideal to their consumers. Although on the acquiring side, a lot of merchants do now offer Ideal as a means of payments at their checkout pages.
Right. So that has changed over time then?
Has changed a lot because of course, I was there on the bank side when we launched Ideal. I was the fast follower, so you have the big three at the time, and then Fortis was the number 4 who actually joined the Ideal scheme to launch it and to offer it to the consumers. On the acquiring side, at launch, the Dutch banks, as being also a large merchant bank as well, offered the Ideal proposition to their merchants as well. But that evolved over time, because what turned out to be very successful was, of course, the simplicity and the efficiency of the system, which made it quite attractive for cross-border merchants to say, so if I open up for Ideal, I might have a more cost-efficient means of payment to offer to my consumers, Dutch consumers then only. And it turned out to be so attractive that almost, I would say, all cross-border acquirers, so large acquirers, said, there's such a request from my merchant base, I need to offer it to be interesting enough for those merchants, because if I don't offer it, I might lose out on business.
Right.
So there was a necessity. And that was kind of the reason that we evolved more on the acquiring side than we actually were able to move on the issuing side.
Right. So for people not in the know, and like you said, everyone in the Netherlands will know Ideal. What is Ideal in essence?
Ideal is an account-to-account payment initiation system.
Right.
Meaning, as such, is a protocol which allows actually a certain information flow, which we manage, and I will come to a second to the new Ideal, but initially it was a bilateral information flow actually set and regulated by a set of scheme regulation, which is nothing more than an acquiring bank getting a message from a merchant that a consumer on the website wants to pay with Ideal, and then the protocol allows you to select the bank and to check whether there's enough balance on the bank side of you as consumer, and that's it. And including, of course, the bilateral and two-way exchange of data. But that's what in essence happens. And then at the end of the day, there's a cutoff moment, and then the financial transaction takes place.
Understood. Right. And pretty much where we are right now is how much % of all, let's say, retail payments are being processed in this way?
they have to always be very careful, so that we rely on external sources. But from an e-com market share perspective, e-com specifically, the Dutch Thuiswinkel.org claims that we have 72% market share.
Wow. So, and how many transactions are we talking about?
It totals up to almost 1.4 billion transactions now. Per year.
Per year, yeah.
And we have to be honest, that is not only e-com, and we have also P2P transactions, as we are also the supporting scheme behind Tiki as an example, what only also a few know. We have e-invoicing as a growing segment as well. So we do see a lot of use cases popping up, including QR code initiated payments as well. But I would say the majority is still e-com, and even e-com is still a growing segment for us.
Yeah. How difficult is it for you as an organization and as a technology to support 1.4 billion e-com transactions and a whole slew of other things?
It was very easy, to be honest and blunt, because the banks actually did all the technical work. But that changed 3 years ago, because that was also the reason why they, let's say, asked me to join Ideal together with Eelco as well as our CIO, because I'm not the technology expert here. I'm more the overall, hopefully, expert, hopefully supporting in the right way the evolution of Ideal. But the core plan, which was, let's say, underlying the fact that we had to, let's say, grow and scale up the organization, was that we took up an additional and quite important step, and that was that we were now also taking a position in the value chain as technology provider. So together with our technology partner Payconic, we built a platform which we call the Ideal Hub, which now allows, because we are alive since a week and a bit, to connect all parties in the Ideal ecosystem to the central Ideal Hub. And that is quite an efficiency gain once more, but for the consumer, it doesn't say that much. Mm-hmm. But for the parties in the ecosystem, the more, in the sense that they are now with one connection able to connect to all parties in the ecosystem. For the consumer, it's also becoming far more important, or let's say, what we believe, let's be a little bit humble here, useful in the sense that what we also did is, if we renew Ideal from a back-end perspective, what I just mentioned, we should also deliver more value add and make a stronger proposition which can compete towards the future with the other ecosystems in play. And we found it an important element to allow consumers to register their profile with us. As we have now the Ideal Hub, we could enrich the transaction in an easy way, and we could help to route the transaction in an even better way, including additional data. And that's what we currently are bringing live. So a consumer is now asked to register himself after a first transaction with the new Ideal, or at his bank in his mobile banking app. And we believe that it's, again, an efficiency gain in the sense that for a consumer, that he doesn't have to pre-fill his delivery address time after time.
Right.
So in essence, it's a kind of an evolution, maybe to, let's say, too vastly said, but it is democratizing the ecosystem once more, as large platforms like Amazon, but also Bol, they already do capture your delivery address. They do already capture your bank preference. But for smaller merchants, it was not able.
Right, understood.
And now we actually offer the same service to all merchants in the ecosystem. So from a merchant perspective, it's easier to offer. From a consumer, it's easier to transact.
Understood. So that means that you're now also able to provide the same functionality as some of the, let's say, larger American payment providers like, I don't know, PayPal or...
Yeah, let's say I think we might even go one step further, as we have the direct interaction with the bank account.
Yep.
And the fact that, yes, let's say on the consumer interface, the likes of PayPal were really well innovating and bringing the right services at the right place, but also at a cost.
Yeah.
And what we tend to do from an ideal scheme is to really manage the balance of the issuing and the acquiring side. In other words, we do not want to create too much consumer preference. We do not want to offer too much merchant preference, but it should actually find each other.
Right.
And that's what we hope to achieve once more now with actually enriching the system with the profile.
Right. And what kind of new functionalities will that allow you to do in the future?
I think there we have to be careful in the sense of what we do still want to offer, given the fact that our European evolution will now more be shaped by EPI rather than by Ideal itself. But from a Ideal hub perspective, it allows us to see all transactions, to actually capture all data as long as we are allowed to, and as long as it adds value. So what we were anticipating to do was to enrich the transaction further to the benefit of either the consumer or the merchant or combined. So think of, for example, age verification, where it is quite a hot topic currently in the Netherlands, that we do want to support further alcohol sales online, but in a secure and well-managed way. And therefore, an age check would be very helpful. And certainly if it will have to be enforced in the near future.
Right, and the platform allows for those kinds of functionalities to plug it in.
We could simply add one, it's maybe too simply said, but we could add additional data to the profile if the consumer does that himself, and we could do an additional check. Yeah. Because we also tend to manage another scheme called IDIN, which is the identification scheme, which allows us to really verify that the person is over 18 years old.
Right.
As an example. Yeah. And we, of course, we did also offer now services to pay in 3 times with Ideal in 3. But that is, I would say, more a separate, I would say, more consumer-oriented innovation, whereby we piggyback on what was already there in the market. But by linking it specifically to Ideal, it becomes an even stronger proposition, and from what we believe also a more safe and sound proposition, as we are able to add additional controls to it.
What is Ideal in 3? What does it do for the consumer?
It is actually quite simple. It allows the consumer to pay, for example, its new fridge or washing machine in 3 installments, whereby the first installment has to be paid immediately. So it's, to our view, a more sustainable proposition where we can perform all the checks at the first transaction, and to also ensure that the vast majority is able to also really pay in 3 terms, in 3 installments.
Yeah. You were talking about EPI just moments ago.
Yeah.
What is EPI?
EPI is the European Payment Initiative, which came alongside back in, I would say, the latter half of 2022, whereby we were already kind of touching the surface whether a probable collaboration could make sense. So it took a while, and it also took a while for EPI to find firm grounds within Europe. Luckily, we were able, with our specifically also led by our shareholding banks, to find a way to actually combine our forces going forward, whereby the banks in the end decided to bring Ideal in EPI, or to sell it to EPI in other words, to support an even stronger start of Wero in the Dutch market. Because to our view, it didn't make sense to keep two competing schemes, because Wero is also an account-to-account based system in the Dutch market. So already from the early start on, we were, we were quite sure that we had to find an agreement there together to ensure that the interests of the banks were well served, so the interests of our shareholders as well. And we were, of course, not in the lead here, because you're never in the lead here, but we well supported the whole period between end of 22 and the end of 23, whereby we are now part of the EPI organization, but only for 51%. So we're not completely owned yet, but it is the intention to become, a fully part of the EPI group, as we tend to call it now, somewhere early next year. And the reason why we do it in phases is that we, of course, have to secure the interest of, and not only the banks, but of all parties in the ecosystem. So all, related parties, like, again, the merchants, specifically the acquirers, the CPSPs, but also the consumers, that they can rely on a stable and effective and still growing payment scheme like Ideal. We can't afford any hurdle there in offering this to the Dutch consumers and Dutch merchants.
Right. So you mentioned earlier that capturing the hearts of European issuers was difficult with Ideal.
Yeah.
Right. So now with Wero, you have a second shot at that. Is that how I see it?
Yeah, it's a little bit different, because Wero has been developed separate from Ideal. It's of course not 100% separate, but it is a separate system. It is a separate development, a separate set of scheme rules and regulations. It's not the same as Ideal. So yes, we do see where we can support each other in learning from each other, but it is a totally separate system. And also, in the end, so if it's in full flow, it is a scheme which allows more functionalities to flourish within the system than we could support currently with Ideal.
Right. So there is going to be a future where Ideal and Wero exist as separate payment technologies.
Yeah, and that's of course what we, are taking up as a challenge, as a constructive challenge, how to manage that in the best possible way for specifically the Dutch market, because it's only a Dutch challenge, as Ideal is only offered by Dutch banks to Dutch consumers.
Right. So I must ask, of course, payments is, of course, the vessel for fraud as well. So I imagine fraud might be a theme for you. And what I want to know is, how does that work in your organization? How do you deal with fraud, or how do you deal with talking to your issuers and to regulators about this subject?
Of course, it is a topic and it will remain a topic. I believe that from an ideal perspective, we are quite well able to manage it. Luckily, because we have indeed strong banks providing also a lot of fraud management and fraud control measures. Because from an ideal scheme perspective, we of course do push for let's say an aligned integration of all kind of let's say specifically data exchanges to allow parties in the ecosystem, specifically again the issuers, but also the acquirers, to manage fraud. And what we tend to do now from an EPI perspective even more is that we want to even further support the ecosystem with providing additional data points, so to speak. Because in the end, it's all about protecting the interests of the consumer, protecting the interests of the merchants, supported by having the right, let's say, data points to be read and interpreted and then actually transferred into a sort of scoring, which you can then apply to either the consumer side or the acquirer side to block the transaction or not. That's in essence what it is.
Right.
And the more data points we have, the more secure we can be.
Right.
We can never be 100% safe and secure, because then there will be no transactions anymore. A little bit exaggerated.
Yeah.
But we have to find and keep on finding the balance. From a Dutch ecosystem, where we have only Dutch issuers, from an ideal perspective, is quite able to well manage it. We have to further upgrade this with an EPI scale, as we are now introducing, of course, cross-border payments as well.
So that's fantastic, because in the end, it's the data that is part of the scheme that you're managing for the issuers and the acquirers then.
Yeah, specifically from an EPI perspective.
Yeah.
But from an ideal perspective, we are, so to speak, only the pass-through.
Right.
And it's up unto the interpretation of the individual issuer and the individual acquirer to actually do and of course enforce by the rules and regulations of the scheme, and that you have to do the transaction monitoring and et cetera, to secure the ecosystem. Yeah. And what we also do is, of course, if let's say measures are not properly implemented, that we are able from a scheme perspective to enforce the implementation.
For me, it sounds like you have in the coming years your challenges ahead of you, and you have a big role in leading the organization into Europe as well. My question is, do you ever think you're going to go back to automotive maybe after you finalize all these payments in the European context?
I think indeed there's still quite, let's say, a journey on the payment side to succeed upon. We have strong partners and strong colleagues, which we found now in EPI, and it's up to us to really make that EPI group successful together. So that will be a challenge. How do we ensure, let's say, a smooth integration of the companies going forward, and also on a personal level as well? How do we ensure that the strengths are optimized and the weaknesses so far possible dissolved? And from a, let's say, more content-driven side, how do we ensure indeed a successful implementation of Wero, and how do we bring it to wisdom and to success here in the Dutch market, supporting the other markets? That will take some years to come. And if I would ever go back to automotive, I think it's now for me more a hobby. And maybe if I'm already, let's say, having my pension or having a more, let's say, relaxed life, then I might think of doing something in kind of either classic cars or so on. But again, more from a hobby perspective rather than from a, I would say, professional career perspective, because there's so much to learn and to do on the payment side that even in 10 years' time, there will be totally different challenges up for us.
Understood. Daniel van Delft, thank you very much for this conversation. And this was Eward Driehuis for ThreatFabric. And we hope you enjoyed it. And let's see you in the next one.
Very welcome. Thanks.